PPS Register, a single search of the register will provide national information. So one of the great things about this is that it applies across the country, all states and territories, companies and individuals alike. So that's one of the great aspects of this system. We don't have different revs for arrangements for different states, V-check, all the different arrangements which existed. Some states didn't even have revs. I think Tassie wasn't in it, and there were others WA was behind. So there were a whole bunch of issues. We've moved forward, and this will move us forward in that area somewhat because we'll now have one search to do. Also, when you do a search, it will create a request for information from NevDis. So potentially, as you get now, you'll be able to get some information from NevDis about write-offs, stolen status information, etc.
So the root replaces water.
Yep. So again, there's some limitations on what you can find out about that. NevDis is generally only as good as what's been reported to it, but you may potentially get some useful information out of that as well, depending on the quality of the information which has gone into it. Note though, as Chris mentioned earlier, there's no ability to search by plate number or by engine number. You've got to search by serial number, by VIN, all right, under the new regime, or by name of selling entity.
Sorry Matthew, I'm not up on the boat thing yet, okay? I'll take that under advisement.
Oh. We won't speak about South Australian requirements, but there are some issues, unless anyone's particularly interested, but there are some issues with South Australia migrating across because of non-recording of VINs, and so for them there are some other interests to consider.
If you're buying a South Australian vehicle,
yep.
Try not to.
Yeah, be careful. Yeah. Okay, PPS Register. So just to explain a little bit more detail about the register concept and what it's all about, it's basically a notice board of security interests. So in that sense, it isn't going to have a lot of detailed information that, say, the ASIC charge registers has. So for anyone who's done ever done an ASIC search and got back the sort of information you can get from ASIC, you will be able to get the full copy of the charge document with all the legal details in there, of 30, 40 pages or whatever it is, or much, much longer. All of that will be kept with ASIC and can be obtained by searching through ASIC. This will contain much more limited information than that. So the sort of information you'll be able to get out of it is details of the grantor, what sort of collateral class they've got an interest over, and sort of the term of the security. So fairly limited information. There's not a sort of an enormous amount of detail on there. Interest will be notified by a financing statement. So we've talked a little bit about those, but that's to be lodged electronically, and effectively that's the document that creates a registered security interest, and there are certain details that have to go in there which are set out in the legislation. People with a bona fide interest will be able to request further details from relevant parties, but there are confidentiality issues. So again, people are able to potentially request a copy of the security agreement. So you need to be aware of that if you've registered a PIMSI in connection with a contract of sale of a vehicle where you haven't been paid and you've supplied the vehicle on credit terms, in that situation, someone may actually be able to potentially obtain a copy of the contract of sale. So if there's anything in there that you don't want people to know about, be aware of those confidentiality issues that can apply. Anybody is able to make a registration on behalf of a secured party, provided they have reasonable grounds to believe a secured party is or will be a secured party in relation to the collateral. So that's the point we talked about, that anyone in this room could register an interest against anything, but they do have to have reasonable grounds to believe that the person they're saying has an interest. If that's not the case, there is a civil penalty involved, and potentially compensation. But because people have that ability, you can expect some people will take it up, and that means security interest can come from unusual places. So in terms of registering an interest, basically, as I'm sure Chris would be delighted to tell you, Dealer Solutions will have certain integrated applications which will allow you to do that, so they'll be able to actually assist you with that process. The sorts of information that you'll have to generate in order to actually register the interest will be things like who's granting the interest, the grantor, the secured party, who's holding the benefit of it, which may just be the dealership, registration end time, the nature of the collateral, including the VIN number in particular. And we highlighted the importance of it being accurate, because if it is inaccurate, it will be defective. And so it's very, very important to ensure that VIN number is right when it's provided for registration purposes. Whether the collateral is consumer or commercial property, and typically you guys with motor vehicles will be dealing with consumer property. All transactions in the PPS Register will incur costs. So registering, searching, there are costs involved in each of those steps. We talked about the timing and the importance of getting in quickly. Registration is effective from the moment the description of collateral becomes available for search on the register. There are different types of collateral that have different default end times for consumer property. So for property described by a serial number such as a car, a motor car, the default time is 7 years. So the interest will last for 7 years. Okay, so I mentioned that there's some ability in some cases to actually register before attachment. So if that occurs, and so this could occur, for instance, where someone's got a term sheet in place or something like that and know that there's going to be a security interest created, so they have got grounds to believe that there will be an interest. But even though if you jump in and do that, it's only when you register the interest that you would get priority, and it will only be enforceable against third parties once the interest is actually attached to the collateral. But it does mean that there is some ability that people will have to try and get earlier registration times. The next point was that the only requirement when registering one is this point that you must believe on reasonable grounds that you will have that interest. And we talked about the fact that if within 5 business days, if you become aware that it won't attach, then there's an obligation to remove or amend the interest accordingly. So there's some important points to note there in terms of timing. Defects in registration can result in an interest becoming an unperfected interest, and that which would lose priority to a subsequently perfected security interest. So if you register a PIMSI but you don't describe it as a PIMSI, then you'll miss out on properly perfecting your interest. If you include an incorrect serial number, then you won't properly perfect your interest. So, and then you run the risk of losing priority. So it's important to take care in registering the details. And the next point to note is that upon registration, the registrar must provide the secured party with a verification statement confirming the registration. So note that's the secured party. It's not the grantor. It's the secured party that is sent that statement. The secured party must then give notice of the verification to the grantor. So if you've granted an interest, the government doesn't notify you. It's the responsibility of the secured party to notify you, but potentially too people can contract out of that obligation. So there could be a clause in a contract that says that's not going to happen, and in some cases people may breach that obligation. So it's important to be aware then that interest can be created, which if you do a search you'll discover that you don't actually know have been registered, because, and they may have been registered legitimately because a contract allowed them to be registered. So I have said to a lot of people to make sure you read your contracts, because otherwise an interest could turn up on the register and nothing is sent to you confirming that, but that occurs, and that is a legal and lawful registration. So that's another feature of the system just to be aware of. The secured party, sorry, just the last point on the slide I wanted to mention, there's an exception there for migrated data. So if, there's not going to be an obligation on every person who currently holds a rev interest to give notification of that interest to every single grantor out there. Otherwise, every single person would be inundated with lots of details of notifications, and the government would be forever issuing verification statements. So But once the system is up and running, we're registering new interests under the regime, then these verification statements will start to become created by the PPS registrar. Okay, so financing steps. Look, there's a variety of steps which are involved in creation of a financing statement. I'm not going to speak to these in great detail, but I'm just going to show you what they are on the slides. The good news is if you're, again, giving Dealer Solutions a bit of a plug, if you're using Dealer Solutions to help with this, all of these particular steps will be built into their processes. They're just things to be aware of.
This is a nightmare.
So they're things like, again, creating secured party groups, setting up filing procedures, determining collateral type, specifying whether it's transitional or a non-transitional interest, providing the secured parties details, etc. I'll leave you to read those in the slides. Transitional security interest. The PPS regime is currently scheduled to start at the end of October. So 31 October is currently listed as the go live date. We'll let you know if that changes, but at this stage that's the date that we think they're working to. The first 24 months after the commencement of the PPS regime is a transitional period. So there are protections for certain transitional security interests during that 2-year period. And to give you an example of one of those, a retention of title arrangement created prior to the introduction of the regime will have some transitional protection during that 2-year period. Those sort of transitional arrangements will continue to have a degree of transitional protection. Yep, far away.
Are those transitional securities, are they PIMSs? They won't be, in the sense that they won't have to be registered as a PIMSy, but they would continue to enjoy the degree of priority they have under the current law. So in other words, a retention of title clause would have the same effect it has now. So an existing retention of title clause that's a transitional security interest would continue to protect that person just the way it protects them under the current law. But they wouldn't be under the category of that super priority?
No, they wouldn't need it. They wouldn't actually need it because they would continue to be protected as the owner of the vehicle. Yeah. So
can they be upgraded to a PIMSy?
It might be possible, yeah. It may well be possible to convert them into PIMSys, and that might be, some people may want to do that because rather than rely on the transitional protection, they may want to notify everyone that that's the case. But potentially some people won't do that. They may well just rely on it because if they've already got protection, they may feel that's enough. So certain registers and their registrations will be migrated to the PPS register automatically. We've spoken about that. And on the slide, we've got some details of some of the migrated security registers. So what will happen with those registers, just to clarify, is they will stop taking new registrations, and all of the existing registrations taken up until the close of those registers will migrate across. So potentially, for instance, I understand that ASIC have said that you may be able to do ASIC searches post the commencement of the regime, but it just won't include new information. It'll just be whatever historically was there, and probably, frankly, that'll be unnecessary and not particularly helpful because all the information in terms of the registered security interest will now be over on the PPS register. So you won't need to search those registers anymore. After the regime commences, you'll just need to search the PPS register. And just to clarify the registers that are coming across in this industry that are going to affect you guys, that's company charges, bills of sale, registered, so revs interests. All of those ones are going to be migrated across. Okay, so we talked about retention of title arrangements and the fact that there will be some transitional protection for those during the 2-year period. Now, obviously, because retention of title arrangements can't be picked up, and this is just as it is at present, if you buy any piece of property that has been sold subject to a retention of title basis, potentially title will not have passed. So, as is the case under the current law, there is no search that you can do to detect that. You've got to track back through the contracts to actually see whether there are any retention of title arrangements in place. And a search of the register is not going to pick up those transitional security interests.
So again, it's pretty important when buying a vehicle, just as it is now, frankly, to confirm that the seller has title to a vehicle before you purchase it. So in that sense, it's not a change from what we're currently used to. Okay, just wanted to emphasise some key takeaways. So a new priority regime will be established, and we've been through that. That will be different from the existing priority regimes. Title-based securities such as leased equipment and retention of title that are not registered may lose priority under the new regime to non-title based security interests that are registered. Floating charges will cease to have legal relevance. So that whole concept of a floating charge will disappear, and the whole terminology of fixed and floating charge will be replaced with new terminology. Particularly, you can expect to see the term general security agreement used much more often than the term fixed and floating charge moving forward for those reasons. All searches are point in time only, so they'll only cover that moment when the search is actually done. They don't sort of necessarily give forward-moving protection. There's no certificate protection as such as there was with REVs. You have to consider protecting your trading terms and whether you're prepared to run a risk as an unsecured creditor. If you want to be a secured creditor, we've outlined the steps that you need to take to protect yourself when selling on trading terms.
That applies, flip that in regards to your suppliers and the people you do business with. So you can expect to see people coming to you saying, I'm changing our trading terms. So people you buy parts off, everyone will be looking to make sure that they can protect themselves, or the smart ones, protect themselves against you going insolvent. So it's both ways. We're hearing past distributors looking to change the terms of agreement on dealers they sell parts to, so they can be a secured creditor. So there will be a change through. So you also want to look at your suppliers and the terms. You get advice from your client, from your solicitor, or Phil, because you plug in me enough, on what you want to do with your suppliers and people you buy off, and what their trading terms are.
And I strongly agree with that, Chris, particularly because, as I said, if you don't read these terms of trade that you get, you may well find that it gives that person an ability to register an interest. And they may go ahead and do that, and you may not actually be aware that that's happened. And so that could create problems for you down the track when you come to do something with whatever it is you've purchased, the parts or the vehicle or whatever it is. So it's quite important to make sure. It was always important to read contracts, but it's more important than ever to actually read those contracts and see what people are trying to ask you to do. Again, there's a national database with PIMSs. Lenders have got 15 business days to register, and they can't backdate. So that's important to note. So how can you prepare? You need to identify what security interests you have, and so particularly if you're selling on credit terms, where are you doing that? So where do we need to register or protect security interests? You need to then put in place appropriate registrations to protect those security interests, and that may require new or amended documentation, not just the process of actually registering, but also your contracts may need to be reviewed, because do they actually allow you to register an interest? They may well not do, so they'll actually have to be changed to allow you to have the ability to register an interest if that's what you want to do. If you don't have retention of title protection, you may need to get it, as well as going out and then registering an interest to protect it. So again, I think it's a great time to give the contracts a real haircut and make sure that they've got the right clauses in it to protect you if you want to go and register interests. Same with redrafting customer credit applications process, and to have steps to include PIMSy status, renegotiating existing credit terms to allow you to grant PIMSs and to
penalties you sell parts to, workshops you sell stuff to, anyone that gets credit off you.
Check and see whether you need to change those contracts and start a process of registering interests. So again, generally, PPS enabling clauses will need to be included. We've talked about the impact this can have on suppliers, and thinking about what you're prepared to do in relation to allowing your suppliers to register security interests over goods supplied to you.
questions about whether you actually want to monitor the PPS register. So particularly, that won't necessarily apply all the time, but there may be key times that if the organisation's looking at a transaction and a buyer, someone might be interested in buying a dealership or something like that, be aware that third parties will be searching this register as well to see what interests you've got registered. If there's a need to start removing those interests or dealing with those financiers, then it's a good time to do that. So a lot of people I'm seeing out there thinking about proactively monitoring the register from particularly at key strategic times, just to see what's there on their own interests and what they need to remove. Again, re-engineering internal practices and procedures to manage timely registration of interest. So the message has to get across the organisation about these things, because given the timeframes, the fact that you've got to register PIMSs, for example, so quickly before you actually deliver vehicles where you're supplying on credit terms, you need to be prepared to respond to that, because you're only as strong as your weakest link in the chain, and if someone doesn't comply, you can lose out in relation to the outcomes under this legislation. So it's very important to make sure that everyone in the organisation understands it and complies with the processes and policies that you adopt.
Just before we go to the next slide, I've been doing some market research with some of our clients, and I had a hilarious conversation with one of our long-term clients. I said, "How often do you deliver cars without getting paid?" "Nah, never happens." And we spent 15 minutes asking some questions. In the end, it was, oh, well, it happens here, it happens with the rental car companies, it happens with people that buy stuff. Yet the people are only too happy to be a little sloppy with when you pay me, particularly at the end of the month, for some reason. All right, so by the time the dealer principal analysed what actually happened with not being paid, it was quite scary. Nearly 25% of the cars went out without actually payment on the day. That's just suicide now, because you no longer have retention of title.
And these things are manageable. These are not processes that are overly difficult. There's some things to work through and a bit of bureaucracy to bash your way through, but it's manageable. But if you drop the ball in the wrong cases, then you're obviously leaving yourself pretty exposed to loss of priority. So just to explain how we can help you. So obviously, I've just highlighted that need potentially to have some training on it, and that's something we can help your organisations with if you need that. Reviewing and amending your customer contracts is important to entitle you to register security interests. So your existing contract probably won't be adequate to do that. It just won't have contemplated this sort of legislation. So you probably will need to get it changed, and you'll need to get it updated and amended to include the right provisions. You may need advice on obtaining clear title when you're purchasing goods, and so where you've got some confusing scenarios that can arise there, we can potentially give you some advice about how to approach that. Again, if you need general security agreements or anything like that, they're the sorts of things we can do. If you need to perfect existing security interests that you might have, we can give you some advice about how to do that, as well as advice generally on the implications of the Act and perhaps any disputes that might arise in future. So that's my contact details, and if anyone has any questions about the regime or needs some assistance with their contracts or any of those things I'd mentioned, we'd be absolutely delighted to help you, and please give me a call.
Phil does leave Queen Street, by the way.